The CEO settled into his seat in the luxurious first-class cabin of the flight, his eyes glancing around at the other passengers boarding the plane. It was just another business trip, one of many in a routine that had become all too familiar. He'd spent countless hours in the air, traveling between cities, meeting with clients, and making high-stakes deals. His role as CEO of a growing tech company required him to constantly be on the move, but it also gave him access to the kind of comfort that made long flights a bit more bearable. Today, as he settled into his plush seat, he was prepared for another lengthy journey. The cabin crew was busy making final preparations for takeoff, and the flight attendants, wearing their perfectly tailored uniforms, moved efficiently down the aisles. He noticed one of them, a woman who looked to be in her late 30s who seemed particularly focused on her tasks. She wasn't smiling much, but he assumed she was just doing her job. It was, after all, a long day for everyone on board. The CEO had learned long ago not to judge anyone based on the first impression. After all, everyone had their own stories, their own lives to live, and their own reasons for the way they behaved. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, the CEO pulled out his tablet and began reviewing the materials for an upcoming meeting. He didn't expect anything exciting to happen on this flight. He had seen it all: delays, turbulence, and even the occasional awkward interaction with flight attendants. But nothing could have prepared him for what was about to unfold. The flight took off smoothly, and he leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a moment to relax. He was deep in thought when the flight attendants began serving the in-flight meals. He wasn't particularly hungry, but figured he might as well have something. When the flight attendant arrived at his row, she offered him the choice between two options. He decided on the chicken dish, hoping it would be a light and satisfying meal. The woman placed the tray on his table with a quick glance and moved on to the next row. The CEO didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't uncommon for flight attendants to be in a rush, especially on longer flights. He began to eat, but the moment he took his first bite, something felt off. The chicken was cold, and as he inspected it more closely, he noticed something that made his stomach churn. There, right on the side of the plate, was a patch of mold. His heart sank. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. This was a first-class flight, the kind of service that was supposed to be impeccable. How could something like this happen? He immediately put the fork down and sat back in his seat, trying to process the situation. For a moment, he considered letting it go. After all, it was just a meal. But then he thought about how important this trip was. He was meeting with potential investors later in the week, and this was his opportunity to make a good impression. If something as simple as food quality could be so wrong, what did it say about the airline's commitment to service? He couldn't let it slide. It wasn't just about the moldy chicken. It was about the principle of the matter. This was a professional setting, and he expected professional service. He pressed the button to call for the flight attendant. When she arrived, she was the same woman who had served him the meal. He looked up at her, trying to keep his tone even and polite. "I'm afraid there's a problem with my meal," he said, his voice steady but firm. "There's mold on it." The attendant glanced down at the plate and then back up at him, her expression unreadable.
"Mold?" she repeated, almost as if she couldn't believe what he was saying.
"That's strange. Let me take a look." She took the plate from him and looked it over for a few seconds, not saying a word. The CEO waited for her to apologize, to offer an explanation, or at the very least to express concern. But instead, the attendant simply nodded and said, "I'll get you a new meal." She didn't seem apologetic or surprised. It was as though she was used to dealing with complaints like this on a regular basis. The CEO watched as she walked away, feeling increasingly frustrated. He didn't want to make a scene, but he couldn't help but feel that this was more than just a simple mistake. A few minutes later, another flight attendant came by with a replacement meal. It was a new dish, but there was no apology, no acknowledgement of the earlier mistake. The meal was served without any fanfare, and the attendant moved on to the next row without saying a word. The CEO sat there staring at the food in front of him, his appetite gone. He didn't touch it. He couldn't help but feel that something was wrong. It wasn't just about the meal or the mistake. It was the attitude of the flight attendants, the indifference, the lack of concern. He had been polite and calm, yet the service he was receiving seemed anything but professional. And as the flight continued, he began to notice something else. The flight attendants were treating him differently. He had seen them interact with the other passengers, and there was a distinct contrast in the way they spoke to him versus everyone else. When they approached his row, their body language shifted slightly, more guarded, more stiff. When they asked him if he needed anything, their tone was curt, almost dismissive. At first, he chalked it up to a bad day or perhaps just a case of tired staff. But as the flight went on, the difference became more pronounced. The CEO began to feel a creeping unease, as though he was being treated differently, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. He had traveled extensively and dealt with all kinds of people. He had encountered flight attendants who were less than enthusiastic about their jobs, but this felt different. He began to wonder if there was something else at play. Was he being treated this way because of his race? He pushed the thought aside, trying to focus on his work and not let his mind wander, but the feeling lingered. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, he was no longer able to ignore the sense of discomfort that had settled in. Every time one of the attendants passed his row, he could feel the distance between them, the coldness in the air. He wasn't sure what to do about it, but he knew one thing. This wasn't just about the meal anymore. There was something deeper going on, something that needed to be addressed. As the flight progressed, the unease turned into frustration. How could this be happening? Why was he being treated like this? It wasn't just bad service, it felt personal. The CEO had dealt with all sorts of challenges in his life, but this was something new, something he wasn't prepared for. He could feel his blood pressure rising, and he knew he had to do something about it. But what could he do mid-flight? He decided to wait until the plane landed. Then he would address the issue head-on. He wasn't going to let this slide. He deserved better than this, and he knew that if he didn't speak up, nothing would change. For the rest of the flight, he steeled himself for what was coming. He wasn't sure how it would unfold, but he knew one thing. The moment the plane landed, he would make sure his voice was heard. The flight continued with a sense of unease that hung in the air. The CEO did his best to push his frustration to the back of his mind, focusing instead on the upcoming meetings and the deals he was about to close. He tried to lose himself in the work he had brought along for the flight, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the situation with the flight attendants. As the hours passed, it became impossible for him to ignore the growing discomfort. Every time a flight attendant passed by, they seemed to avoid eye contact with him, walking just a little too quickly to make any sort of connection. It wasn't the kind of service he was accustomed to, especially not in first class. He had flown on countless flights, but this one felt different. The tension was palpable. He decided to take a moment to assess the situation. The flight attendant's behavior wasn't just rude, it felt calculated. It was as though they were treating him like he didn't belong there. Their coldness didn't just come from the moldy food or the rushed service, it was something deeper. He began to question if there was a racial element to it. He had been traveling for years, encountering all types of people from all walks of life. But this felt different. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the subtle jabs, the dismissive attitudes, weren't accidental. He had experienced prejudice before, but never so overtly, and certainly never in such a public setting. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the evidence was staring him in the face. The flight attendants were treating him with a level of disregard that he couldn't ignore. He glanced around the cabin and saw other passengers chatting comfortably with the attendants, laughing, enjoying their meals. It wasn't just about bad service. It was the fact that no one else seemed to be experiencing the same cold treatment. The CEO's mind started to race as he replayed the events of the flight in his head. The moldy food had been the first red flag, but it was the attitude of the flight attendants that truly unsettled him. It was as though they had already made up their minds about him before he'd even opened his mouth. The CEO was used to being in control of situations. In his business life, he was the one who made decisions, who called the shots. He was a leader. But here on this plane, he felt powerless. He didn't know how to address this without making a scene. But as time went on, he grew more and more certain that he couldn't let this go. Not this time. He had been wronged, and he wasn't going to sit quietly and allow it to continue. As the plane neared its destination, he began to mentally prepare for what he knew he had to do. The flight was almost over, and he had already made up his mind. He would confront the flight crew as soon as they landed. There was no way he was going to let this go without speaking up. He had dealt with plenty of challenges in his life, but this felt like an issue he needed to address. His hand hovered over the call button once again. This time he wasn't going to let them brush him off. He wasn't going to sit quietly while his dignity was disregarded. The CEO's mind raced with the possibilities. He had been mistreated, and now he had to decide whether he was going to stand up for himself, even if it meant making an uncomfortable scene. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that this wasn't something he could let slide. He wasn't just a passenger on a plane. He was a person who deserved to be treated with respect. No one should have to endure the kind of disrespect that he was experiencing, not in any setting, and certainly not in a professional environment like this. The plane began its descent, and the CEO braced himself for what was about to happen. He knew that when the plane landed, things would escalate. He wasn't sure how it would play out, but he knew he had made the right decision. As the wheels touched the runway and the plane slowed to a stop, the CEO felt a sense of determination building within him. He had dealt with worse in his life. He had faced down bigger challenges, but this was personal. It wasn't just about poor service, it was about standing up for what was right. It was about saying enough is enough. He wouldn't let this experience define him. He wouldn't let these flight attendants get away with what they had done. The moment the plane came to a complete stop, he stood up, grabbed his bag, and made his way to the exit. He didn't look back. The flight attendants were still in the aisles, helping passengers disembark, but he had already made up his mind. The next step was clear. He would demand to speak to the head of the crew, and he wouldn't leave until the issue was addressed. As he reached the exit door, he made eye contact with the flight attendant who had served him the moldy food earlier. She didn't acknowledge him, but he could see the faintest flicker of recognition in her eyes. She knew exactly what was coming. The CEO's heart pounded as he stepped off the plane. He was done being polite. He was done letting it slide. It was time to make his voice heard. The moment his feet hit the ground, he felt a rush of adrenaline. The confrontation that he had been dreading was now unavoidable. He wasn't going to be the one who walked away from this without holding someone accountable. He had every intention of making sure that this experience wasn't just brushed aside as a minor inconvenience. He was going to make sure it was taken seriously. The CEO found the head flight attendant at the gate, waiting for passengers to clear out of the plane. He approached her with a calm but firm demeanor, his voice clear. "I need to speak with you," he said, and she immediately turned to face him, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "I have a complaint," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "The service I received on this flight was unacceptable. It wasn't just about the food. It was about the way I was treated by your crew. I expect better, especially when I'm flying first class." The head attendant nodded, looking uncomfortable. She didn't know how to respond, but the CEO wasn't giving up. He wasn't going to let them off the hook this time. He had made up his mind, and he was going to make sure that this issue was dealt with. The head flight attendant appeared uncomfortable, her eyes shifting slightly as the CEO spoke. He could see that she wasn't sure how to handle the situation, and that only added to his growing frustration. This wasn't just a simple mistake. This was about the lack of respect he had been shown during the flight. He had made it clear, calmly but firmly, that he would not accept it. The CEO didn't want to escalate the situation unnecessarily, but he also wasn't going to let it slide. He stood tall, his posture commanding the attention of the attendant. "I've flown countless times, and this is not the kind of service I expect, especially on a flight like this," he continued. "The food was served with mold on it, but it's more than that. It's the way I was treated by your staff, dismissed, avoided, as though my concerns didn't matter." The head flight attendant opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. She was clearly caught off guard by the directness of his complaint. It wasn't common for passengers to confront the crew in such a way. Most would simply let it go, resigning themselves to a poor experience, but not the CEO. He had spent years building his company, fighting for respect and acknowledgement in a competitive world. He wasn't about to let anyone, no matter their position, disrespect him, especially not when he had done nothing to warrant it. "I understand your frustration," the attendant finally said, her voice unsure, "but I'm sure it was just a mistake with the food. I'll make sure to report it to management." The CEO shook his head. "This isn't just about a mistake with food. It's about a pattern of behavior. This isn't the first time I've noticed your crew treating me differently. It's subtle, but it's there. You may not even realize it, but it's obvious to me." It's not just about the service, it's about the way I'm being treated. He could see that his words were hitting home. The attendant's face shifted, a flash of realization passing over her features. She knew what he was talking about now. The attitude, the indifference, it was all becoming clear to her. But her response was still too guarded, too defensive. She didn't seem to fully grasp the weight of what had happened. "I'm sorry you feel that way," she said, but it felt more like a scripted apology than an acknowledgement of the actual issue. She glanced over her shoulder, likely hoping that someone else would step in to smooth things over. But the CEO wasn't going to let that happen. He needed her, and the rest of the crew, to understand that this behavior was unacceptable. "I'm not here for an apology," he said firmly. "I'm here because I want action. I want to ensure that this doesn't happen to anyone else. It's clear to me that your crew's treatment of me wasn't a mistake, it was intentional. You need to take responsibility for this." The head attendant nodded, her expression now serious. She clearly understood that the CEO wasn't going to let this go, but she also seemed unsure of how to proceed. She had never dealt with a passenger who was so determined to call out the crew, and it was clear that she was out of her depth. But the CEO wasn't interested in excuses. He had worked too hard to get where he was to allow this kind of behavior to slide. As he stood there, waiting for the attendant to take him seriously, he thought about the many other times he had been dismissed, ignored, or looked down upon simply because of his race. It wasn't something he liked to dwell on, but moments like this made it impossible to ignore. He knew that if he didn't speak up, nothing would change. The CEO's thoughts were interrupted when he noticed the flight manager approaching from behind. The manager had overheard their conversation and was now walking toward them, a look of concern on his face. "Is there a problem here?" the manager asked, his tone more professional than apologetic. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with the kind of authority that typically demanded respect. But the CEO wasn't about to be intimidated. He had reached his breaking point, and now it was time to address the situation head-on. "Yes," the CEO replied, his voice steady. "There is a problem. I've just had a conversation with your head attendant, and I've made my concerns clear. The meal was served with mold, but more importantly, I was treated poorly throughout the flight. The attitude of your staff was dismissive, and I feel that I was treated differently than the other passengers." The flight manager's eyebrows furrowed as he processed the information. It wasn't every day that a passenger had such a strong complaint. He glanced at the head attendant, who avoided his gaze. She clearly wasn't prepared for this level of scrutiny. "I'm very sorry you feel this way, sir," the flight manager said, his tone slightly defensive. "We take these matters seriously and we'll look into it immediately. But I assure you that our staff is trained to treat all passengers with respect." The CEO crossed his arms and looked directly at the flight manager. "I'm sure they are, but actions speak louder than words. I was treated with disrespect, and I want to make sure that this is addressed properly. I don't want an apology, I want this to be taken seriously." The flight manager hesitated for a moment, clearly realizing the gravity of the situation. He nodded slowly, as if coming to a decision. "I understand, sir. I'll report this to the higher-ups immediately, and we'll review the situation with the crew." The CEO didn't back down. "I expect more than just a report. I want to know what steps you're going to take to ensure that this doesn't happen again." The flight manager nodded again, looking more composed now that the situation had been laid out before him. "We will conduct an internal review. I can't promise immediate results, but I assure you that we take all complaints seriously. I'll also make sure that the staff involved are spoken to." It wasn't the kind of resolution the CEO had hoped for, but it was a start. He didn't expect immediate change, but he knew that speaking up was the only way to make sure that something like this wouldn't be swept under the rug. He had a sense of accomplishment. He had confronted the issue head-on, and he had made sure his voice was heard. As he turned to leave, he glanced back at the crew, who were watching him with a mix of discomfort and uncertainty. The flight manager's promise wasn't enough to wipe away the sour taste the CEO had in his mouth, but it was something, at least for now. He knew he had done the right thing. The CEO walked away from the gate, his mind still racing. He had done what he felt was necessary. He had spoken up, and he had made sure his voice was heard. But as he moved through the airport, the weight of the situation still hung over him. He had confronted the flight attendants, the flight manager, and anyone who would listen. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this experience was more than just a personal frustration. It was part of a larger pattern, a systemic issue that was far too common. He thought about the hundreds, if not thousands, of people who must have experienced similar treatment and kept quiet. How many people had been mistreated in small ways, like the disregard he had faced during the flight and didn't speak up because they didn't want to cause trouble. It was easy to see why so many people chose to stay silent, to avoid confrontation, to not rock the boat. But as the CEO walked through the airport, he realized that staying silent wouldn't change anything. He wasn't willing to let this moment pass without trying to make a difference. As he boarded the train to his car, his thoughts drifted back to the crew. He knew it wasn't just about him. He knew that it wasn't just the flight attendants who needed to be held accountable. It was the entire culture of the airline. This wasn't the first time he had heard about poor treatment of passengers, especially passengers of color. He had seen stories online, heard complaints from other business travelers, and even personally experienced issues with airlines in the past. The truth was, this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a deeper problem, one that needed to be addressed. The CEO knew that he could walk away from this moment, let it go, and move on with his life. But that wasn't what he was about. He was about change, about pushing for better. He wasn't going to let this experience fade into the background. The more he thought about it, the more determined he became. This wasn't just a personal issue. It was something larger, something that needed to be confronted head-on, and he was the one who had to do it. When he reached his car, he pulled out his phone and began drafting an email. He had already spoken to the flight manager, but that wasn't enough. He wanted to make sure that this went further. He wanted to make sure that the airline understood the gravity of what had happened. He wasn't going to just be another passenger who walked away from a bad experience. He was going to push for real change. He drafted the email carefully, his fingers moving quickly over the keyboard as he outlined the entire experience. He described the moldy food, the dismissive attitude of the flight attendants, and the way they had treated him differently from the other passengers. He wasn't angry, but there was a quiet determination in his words. He wrote about how this wasn't just about bad service, it was about a lack of respect and dignity. And it was about how he wasn't going to let that go without speaking up. Before hitting send, the CEO paused for a moment. He knew that this email could be ignored, dismissed as just another complaint. But he wasn't going to let that happen. He added a line at the end of the email, requesting a formal response. He made it clear that he expected a follow-up, that he wanted to know what steps the airline was going to take to address the situation. He wasn't just voicing his dissatisfaction. He was calling for accountability. He hit send, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He had done his part. But he knew that this was just the beginning. The email would reach someone, whether it was the head of customer service, the CEO of the airline, or someone higher up. And once it did, the ball would be in their court. The CEO left the airport and made his way to his hotel. As he checked in, he felt a strange sense of calm. He had done what he could to address the issue, and now it was out of his hands. But he knew that speaking out was important. Too many people had been ignored for too long, and he didn't want to be one of them. As he sat in his hotel room that evening, he reflected on the events of the day. It had started like any other business trip, but it had quickly become something much more significant. He had confronted an issue that had been simmering for a long time. And in doing so, he had taken a stand, not just for himself but for others who had faced similar treatment. The CEO knew that this wasn't going to be the last time he would face challenges like this. But he also knew that he wouldn't back down. He had worked too hard, fought too long, and overcome too much to let something as simple as bad service or discrimination define him. He wasn't going to let this moment pass without doing something about it. As he sat there in his hotel room, a sense of purpose began to settle in. He wasn't just another frustrated passenger. He wasn't just complaining about bad food or poor service. He was standing up for himself and for anyone else who had been treated unfairly. This was his moment to make a difference,